In those days, it was almost as if it was three separate airlines with the same name, because our rules were different and our approaches were different to things. Well, it started out where our flight service went up to our president of our division, who was Mr. Gray at the time, went up to his office with some problems that we thought needed to be solved. And there was half a dozen of us or so, and everybody had a problem to present, and mine was the fact that the Pacific Division charged for drinks and the Atlantic Division didn't. And when passengers were going around the world from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they would always receive a small shock when we started charging them, and many of them assumed that the flight attendants were pocketing the money. Anyway, they complained frequently. And then going in the other direction, they would be charged in the Pacific, and then in the Atlantic, they wouldn't be charged, and they would say, "Why is this?" So we didn't think it was a good policy. Passengers were unhappy about it. So I presented this problem to Mr. Gray, and he said, "Well, I'm sorry, but we're going to continue to charge for drinks in the Pacific." And I say, "Well, what do I tell the passengers?" And they said, "Tell them I said so." So that's exactly what I did after that. When the passengers complained about it, I said, "Please correspond with Mr. Gray in San Francisco." Well, then came the day that we were told, that those of us who would be affected by it, that Mr. Trippe was coming out to the Pacific Division, and he hadn't been out in quite some years. There was a lot of fuss going on to be prepared for this visit. And special meals were contacted or made up, and we were told what to do and so forth and so on. And I was going to take him from Wake to Guam and serve breakfast when we left Wake with a choice of entrees. Well, I got on board, and Mr. Trippe was in his bunk, and he didn't get out of his bunk until about an hour before we arrived in Guam. He didn't want any breakfast. But he went downstairs with his friend was on the 377. He went downstairs into the bar, our little bar downstairs, lounge, and asked for 2 drinks for he and his friend, he and his friend. So I went over to the bar and started making them, and I thought, "Well, Yvonne, I guess you can put your job on the line," because I knew very well if my boss in San Francisco knew I was charging the president of the airplane for a drink, I would have been fired immediately. So I served the drink to Mr. Trippe, and I said, "Mr. Trippe, that'll be $1.50, please." And he said, "What?" I said, "We charge for drinks in the Pacific, Mr. Trippe." I said, "Our passengers aren't very happy about it, but we charge for drinks in the Pacific, and they're 75 cents a piece. So that's $1.50 for your 2 drinks." And he says, "Oh, okay." And he started patting his pockets to find out where he'd find his money, and he didn't have any money on him. So he turned to his friend and borrowed $1.50 from his friend to pay me. 1 month later, the order came from headquarters. There will be no charging for drinks in the Pacific Division.
Did Mr.
And
Gray?
I have to I gave myself a little pat in the back, thinking that I had solved the problem.
Did Mr. Gray ever comment
Never said a
on it?
word. And I wasn't fired.